Hello everyone, and welcome back to another session in Anatomy and Physiology 2. In this session we're going to go over the digestive system. A lot of the anatomy of the digestive system that's the first part of your chapter talks about, I'm not going to cover it in great detail. In fact, I'm only going to mention those structures that are kind of as they relate to their physiological function. So I'm not even really going to talk about the stomach being a J-shaped organ or talk about the different layers of muscles that go around the stomach, that you have the longitudinal, the circular, and then you have the oblique muscles that go around the stomach. So I will only mention just the needed information for the physiology. So I guess the take-home message I'm trying to convey is that it will be very heavily physiologically based, this chapter is, and that's primarily what we're going to cover. The anatomy portion of it will be covered in our lab class. So for lab, we will talk about the various different structures, and you will have a lab practical over those structures of the digestive system. So, as you're probably very intimately acquainted with, your digestive system's job is to ingest and process food, but those aren't the only jobs of it. The ingestion process takes place when you place the food into your mouth. So those structures that you would associate with ingestion would be your teeth. You have 32 adult teeth, 22 what they call baby teeth, or deciduous teeth. So ingestion starts when you put the food in your mouth. Chewing is a process known as mastication that breaks that food down into smaller chunks. And then by the time you put something far enough in the back of your throat, there is a reflex to swallow. That reflex changes from infancy to toddler to adult. You'll notice that infants have a very interesting reflex, a swallowing reflex, and they have a suckling reflex that causes them to thrust their tongue out. That's why you should not feed your little one solid foods before they're ready, because they will just kind of stick it out their mouth, because when they eat, they thrust their tongues out in order to suckle. The swallowing reflex matures as children go from toddler through to childhood and so forth. Also involved with ingestion are the taste buds of the tongue, and you have various different sensories, taste buds that will pick up different sensations, whether it's salty, sweet, sour, on different locations of your tongue. Interestingly to know that people that have a lot of taste buds usually don't like really spicy or flavorful foods. It's too much for them. It's like sensory overload. The fewer taste buds you have, the more likely you are to like really spicy foods. So for my husband and my children, some of my children, my son kind of eats like I do, but for my husband and my oldest, they don't really like anything that's spicy at all. They can't tolerate it, they can't stand it, and this is even like if we do tacos and we do like a mild salsa or something. So they are likely, and they like really bland sorts of foods, so they very likely just have a greater density of taste buds, and they're very sensitive to those changes in flavors. So the mechanical processing aspect involves actual chewing or mastication, and that involves your teeth, and it also involves your tongue. It's a reflex, and where I said that reflex sort of changes as you get older. By the time that you're a child, and you're coming out of that kind of toddler stage, that 3 to 4 toddler stage, your tongue helps to roll the food around in your mouth in a little ball that we call a bolus that you'll eventually swallow. So that mechanical processing is just chewing, 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 and then your tongue, even without your knowledge, it's just sort of a reflex, will roll the food around that you've been chewing into a nice little ball so that you can, well, it's not perfectly symmetrical, but it is ball shaped. That's why they call it a bolus, that you end up swallowing. Now, the 2 points that you have a control over what happens in your digestive system, a conscious control, are at ingestion and mechanical processing. You decide what you're going to put into your mouth, you decide what you're going to chew, and you're going to masticate. Now, once we get it swallowed and it goes down into the esophagus, that is all reflective. And the esophagus moves what we call like a peristalsis, and that one portion of the esophagus will contract while another portion relaxes. And then the next portion contracts while another portion relaxes, and they're just wave-like contractions. So that's what peristalsis means, just these wave-like contractions that happen in the esophagus. And actually this peristalsis happens throughout the digestive system, from your esophagus on throughout your colon, where they're just these wave-like contractions. that are happening. And there are cells that are going to be triggered locally to contract and to relax, to move this bolus down into your stomach past a couple of sphincters. You have your pyloric sphincter up top, the opening of your stomach that the food drops into. And once it goes into your stomach, then we have some more, a little bit of digestion takes place with various different hormones that we're going to talk about, various different chemicals like hydrochloric acid. Then we have the secretion process, the secretion of these hormones, the secretion of these chemicals that are responsible or needed to process the food. And then the absorption process takes place primarily in your small intestine. So most of your food gets absorbed through your small intestine. There is a little bit of absorption, primarily water, that happens in your large intestine, and some things like alcohol can absorb through your stomach, but primarily I would say 90–85% of things that get absorbed are through your small intestine. And then excretion is just whatever it is that you don't use, and that's primarily the function of your colon, your rectum, and your anus. So the saliva in your mouth, that's all part of the kind of ingestion mastication process. It has a couple of jobs. It helps to lubricate your mouth. It keeps it from getting too dry. It moistens and lubricates the materials in your mouth, including your food. In your saliva, you do have an enzyme called salivary amylase, and the job of salivary amylase is to help break down starchy things, complex carbs. So that there is a little teeny tiny bit of digestion that takes place in your chemical digestion that takes place in your saliva, in your mouth, but it's just really to break down carbs. And then there are also chemicals that help to stimulate your taste buds and provide sensory information in your saliva. As we make our way down past the esophagus, once we swallow, there's a sphincter at the top that we call the upper esophageal sphincter. And that sphincter opens up as a response of baroreceptors or pressure reflexes that will open that up once the bolus or the bowl of food gets back there. And it goes down into the lower esophageal sphincter that opens up into the stomach. And that lower esophageal sphincter can also be known as the pyloric sphincter, because they're one and the same. The esophagus is going to meet the stomach. So once we get into the stomach, there are four major functions that I want you to know of the stomach. First of all, it stores ingested food. So it's a temporary storage facility for ingested food. Second of all, it's involved in the mechanical breakdown of ingested food. There are three different layers of muscles that go around your stomach, and they go in three different directions. And what they will do is they allow the stomach to turn and to churn that food to help to further mechanically break it down so that it can be chemically digested further and then absorbed in the small intestine. Along with the mechanical breakdown of food as a role of the stomach, we also have the chemical breakdown of food with things like hydrochloric acid and various types of enzymes that are secreted by the stomach, so that we not only physically break the food down more, so not mastication or chewing breaks the food down, but then also the churning of the stomach helps to kind of disrupt those bonds and break it down even further. And then we have chemicals that will break down those bonds even more. So when we talk about food, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. We're primarily talking about those macromolecules of life that you learned in an introductory biology class, where we talked about carbohydrates, which are made out of glucose, proteins made out of amino acids, and lipids made out of glycerol and fatty acid tails. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in the metabolism chapter, the next chapter that we cover. You also have intrinsic factors that allow for, it's a glycoprotein required to absorb vitamin B12 in the small intestine. So the absorption of vitamin B12, which is fundamental in building red blood cells, also happens in the stomach. So these are some of the four main functions of the stomach that I want you all to remember. So as we're in the stomach, and we talked about that chemical process of breaking those bonds in a carbohydrate, or breaking those bonds in a protein, or breaking those bonds in a lipid, there are different types of cells that will provide the chemical basis for that. So first we have parietal cells. The job of parietal cells is to secrete an intrinsic factor that we'll talk about a little bit later on, as its role is involved in more hormones, and hydrochloric acid. Chief cells, on the other hand, most of them are at the base of the gastric gland, and we'll talk about exactly where that is in a few slides. And they secrete pepsinogen. Pepsinogen's job is to start breaking down protein, so it breaks down those amino acids. For right now, parietal cells, hydrochloric acid, we'll talk about exactly how that happens in a slide or two, and then chief cells are going to secrete pepsinogen. Now, because hydrochloric acid is a very corrosive agent, any cell that just secretes hydrochloric acid all by itself is probably going to have some damage to it. So in order to secrete that hydrochloric acid, we don't just secrete it all out in one big shebang. There is a chemical process to it. I am going to put a little sunshine on this because this chemical process is so important that you're probably going to have it on a short answer question. So first and foremost, in order for those, now were they chief cells or were they parietal cells that made that hydrochloric acid? You guys remember? Let's go back for a second. They were the parietal cells that made the hydrochloric acid. So first and foremost, parietal cells go through this process. So the hydrogen ions are generated by the parietal cells as the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, and we remember carbonic anhydrase from the respiratory chapter, don't we? Or we talked about carbonic acid in the respiratory chapter. So carbonic anhydrase converts carbon dioxide and water to carbonic acids, H2CO3. This H2CO3, so there's carbon dioxide, water, plus that enzyme carbonic anhydrase, and what that really does is it kind of chemically rearranges this carbon dioxide and the water, and you have this carbonic acid. This carbonic acid is going to dissociate into a bicarbonate ion and a hydrogen ion. So keep in mind, this is all happening in a parietal cell. So this carbonic acid breaks down into a base, the bicarbonate ion, and it breaks down into an acid, the hydrogen ion. The bicarbonate ion is going to leave out of the parietal cell and go into the bloodstream. So it's not going to go towards the lumen of the stomach, or it's not going to go to the cavity of the stomach itself. That bicarbonate is going to leave out. However, there's a counter-transport mechanism, so for the bicarbonate that goes out, somebody else has to come back in, and that somebody else that comes back in is chloride. Now, let's stop for a second. Does this not look familiar? Does this not look like something that we've talked about in the respiratory system as one of those mechanisms, and this is also one of your short answer questions, one of those mechanisms by which we were able to get carbon dioxide back to the lungs, where we didn't call it the alkali tie, we called it a chloride shift. So it's basically the same process, except that it's not happening in a red blood cell to bring carbon dioxide back to the lungs. It's happening in a parietal cell in your stomach in order to get chloride into the cell. So the hydrogen is going to be actively transported with, and when we say active transport, that just means it has to use energy, actively transported into the lumen of the stomach or the gastric pit or the gastric glands. Your stomach is not just one smooth area. It has rugae on it, or these ridges, and then these ridges have deep invaginations in them, or deep pits in them that we call gastric pits, where we find the abundance of these cells and a lot of these secretions are going to come out from. So the hydrogen ion is going to move out as a result of using energy. Counter-transport mechanisms don't require energy because you're pushing one guy out while another guy comes in. Who we want to push out into the bloodstream is bicarbonate, and chloride we want to push back in. So the chloride then will make its way through, and the hydrogen and the chloride are going to be attracted to one another. The hydrogen ion is missing an electron. The chloride ion has an extra electron, so boom, match made in heaven. And then we have our hydrochloric acid. So these are the 4 steps that take place for a parietal cell to make hydrochloric acid. Pepsinogen is reliant upon hydrochloric acid to be converted. So pepsinogen is converted by the hydrochloric acid that was made by the parietal cells to pepsin, which is the active enzyme, and its whole job is to break down proteins. So the pyloric glands are located in the pylorus. You have those sphincters I told you about. At the top you have the pyloric sphincter, or It's not the pyloric, it's the gastric. At the top you have the gastric sphincter, and at the bottom of the stomach you have the pyloric sphincter. When you think of pylo or pyloric, a lot of times you think of a pyromaniac, someone who likes fire. Because of all of those enzymes and hydrochloric acid, the pH of the, now what we call chyme, we don't call it a bolus now, that food that you swallowed, the pH of that chyme is not going to be very acidic. So the pyloric canal, or the pylorus of the stomach, is going to be at the bottom portion of the stomach, or the portion closest to going into the small intestine. So the pyloric glands are going to be located in this area. They produce a lot of mucus secretions, and those mucus secretions help to protect the lumen of the stomach from the hydrochloric acid and from all those enzymes there. Also in the pylorus, in those pyloric glands, you have G cells that produce a hormone called gastrin, and then you have D cells that release a hormone called somatostatin, and this hormone counterbalances the gastrin. So somatostatin inhibits the release of gastrin. So they kind of are what we call they work antagonistically against one another. And we'll talk more specifically about what each one of these hormones does in a second. So gastrin and somatostatin are both important in the hormonal control of the activity of the stomach, and then a little bit of the activity of the small intestine. So there are three phases of gastric control: the cephalic, the gastric, and the intestinal phase. Digestion is so important. It's such a large organ system, and such a complicated, I should say, organ system, and it has so many different roles and so many different things that it has to do in order to facilitate its function, that there are specific hormones and specific nerves that are responsible for digestion. So to regulate gastric activity, it actually has its own nervous system and its own hormonal system. So we have some aspects of digestion are controlled by your brain and your spinal cord, the central nervous system, but there is a regulation of short reflexes that happen just within the digestive system itself. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about swallowing and those cells in the esophagus that are causing peristalsis, or these wave-like contractions to take place, that we say that it has its own enteric. That's what the E stands for, nervous system, because it is just so developed, so well developed, and so well organized that we can even say that technically you don't just have two nervous systems, the central and the peripheral nervous system. The digestive system, the enteric, actually has its own nervous system. It has its own hormonal system as well, because there's so many different hormones that are involved. So it's regulated by hormones of the digestive tract. So this first set of bullets here, these are just kind of a discussion on how is gastric activity controlled, and it's not all outsourced to the central nervous system. A lot of it can be done locally with the enteric nervous system and also with the enteric endocrine system. So the three phases of gas control, the first phase of it is controlled by your central nervous system. That's the cephalic phase, which means that digestion primarily is going to begin in your head. The gastric phase is going to include things that happen in your stomach, and then the intestinal phase is going to include absorption and secretion of the foods that you have just consumed. So the cephalic phase, first phase, just the smell, the sight, the taste, and sometimes even the thought of food when you're hungry is going to trigger your brain to send information through the vagus nerve to your stomach to begin to prep for eating this food. So some of the things that happen in your mouth are going to be that you'll salivate. So if you're hungry, you'll start to salivate as you smell food, or if you think about food, or sometimes for people that eat at the same time every single day, like when my mother was, before she retired, she would always eat lunch at 11 o'clock every day, and like clockwork on the weekends, she had to eat at 11 o'clock, no matter where we were, no matter what it was that was going on. She had kind of trained herself to eat at 11 o'clock. So she would just, the thought of that would start to cause her stomach to grumble a little bit, and she would have these thoughts of food, and it would cause her body to prep for this digestion. So the vagus nerve is going to send information to the cells of your stomach so that your cells will make mucus, and we're making mucus to protect it from the pepsinogen that you're going to make at your chief cells, and more importantly to protect it from the hydrochloric acid that's going to be made from your parietal cells. You're also going to have your G cells that are going to make gastrin. And this gastrin is a hormone that's responsible and needed for other hormones to do their job in the digestive system. Next phase is the gastric phase. So at this point, we've actually had some food come into the stomach. So we've gone through ingestion, we've gone through mastication, we've now swallowed it, and it's going into our stomach. So because of the food that's going into our stomach, it's going to actually cause the stomach to distend. So the stretch receptors are going to be stimulated, and as the stretch receptors are stimulated, then that's further going to stimulate the mucus cells, the chief cells, and the parietal cells to make more of their secretions, mucus, pepsinogen, and hydrochloric acid, to break down the food that's coming into your stomach. Because we have this hydrochloric acid that's made, that's going to trigger the chemoreceptors, and those chemoreceptors, like the stretch receptors, are going to also stimulate those cells. So you see how this is a positive feedback loop that we're having, that we see happening here? And then the submucosal and myenteric plexus are going to trigger the stomach to churn, or to have the mixing waves, to kind of make sure that we not only mechanically break down the food, but we're also chemically breaking it down, and every last bit of it's being coated with pepsinogen and hydrochloric acid. And then in the intestinal phase, a lot of this is under neural control, and some of this is under a hormonal control. But it's all going to be under the control of the local nerves and the local hormones. So as the food is now making its way into the small intestine here, notice that we have a different set of hormones, CCK, GIP, and secretin. They're going to be released, and as they're released, that's going to tell the chief cells and the parietal cells to stop doing what they're doing. Stop making pepsinogen, stop making hydrochloric acid, and it's also going to tell the myenteric plexus to stop peristalsis, so stop the churning of the stomach. We don't really need that to take place anymore. So what CCK does, or when that's secreted, is when we have is when we have lipids and carbohydrates that are coming into the small intestine. And then secretin, its job is to bring down that very high pH that to bring up that very low pH when the chyme goes from the stomach through, and this area here is what we call the pylorus, that last little part of the stomach. So that last little part of the stomach there is called the pylorus, and that's where that fiery hydrochloric acid laden chyme is found. So that's where we are going to release that. So since the pH is so low because of the hydrochloric acid, then secretin is going to kind of counterbalance that. So the small intestine's major role is in there's some digestion that takes place, but mostly the absorption of nutrients. So 90% of your nutrients are going to be absorbed in your small intestine. Within your small intestine, you have what we call brush border enzymes. They are on the surface of intestinal microvilli, and they will break down any materials that come into contact with them. So any of that chyme that goes into the small intestines from the stomach is going to inevitably brush against those brush border enzymes, and then it'll further break it down. Enteropepsidase is a brush border enzyme that works on breaking down proteins, so it activates pancreatic proenzyme trypsinogen. So real important aspect to kind of remember here and to think about is that anything that's a pepsidase on there or pepsinogen is going to break down proteins. Enteroendocrine cells are any of those hormones or any cells in the digestive system that will release hormones that are just involved in digestion. So gastrin is one that we talked about. We talked about CCK or closed cyclokinin. We'll just call it CCK, and we talked about secretin. So those are some of the enteroendocrine cells that are some of the enteroendocrine chemicals that are released from the small intestine. The first part of your small intestine, small intestine, is broken up into three parts. You have the duodenum at the top, the jejunum is in the middle of it, and the ileum is at the end. The duodenal glands are going to make lots and lots and lots of mucus, and we want to make lots and lots of mucus to protect, and the same reason that we wanted to make mucus in the stomach, to protect the intestines from that very low pH of the chyme that arrives from the stomach. The gastroenteric reflex, in much the same way that we had it stimulate the motility or movement of the stomach and stimulate the motility of the bolus as it went through the esophagus and entered into the stomach, is going to do the same thing in the small intestines. The gastroileal reflex is going to be the arrival of chyme that comes at the very end of the small intestine, the ileum, and it's going to trigger the relaxation of the ileocecal valve to go into the first part of the large intestine called the cecum. So gastroileal reflex is just the relaxation of that ileocecal valve that allows materials to go from the small intestine to the large intestine. Now these structures, I'm not showing you pictures of these structures in the notes right now, but we will see them in lab, and then you do have these pictures to refer back to in your textbook. So along this area here, the very first part of the small intestine, the duodenum, you're going to find the pancreas hanging out on the other side. So we talked about in ANP1 that the pancreas is not only an endocrine organ, but it's also an exocrine organ. So last semester in ANP1, we just talked about the pancreas and its endocrine functions and the hormones that it made with glucagon as well as making insulin. Now we're going to talk about the exocrine aspect of the pancreas, and that it makes the needed enzymes to further digest and break down the food that's derived in the small intestine, or the chyme that's derived from the small intestine from the stomach. And it produces what we call, in a nutshell, pancreatic juices. Within those pancreatic juices are various enzymes that will break down different types of food products. And let's have a look at a few of those food products that it can be broken down. So first and foremost, we have pancreatic amylase. Pancreatic alpha amylase is much like salivary amylase, whose job is to break down carbohydrates. So it breaks down starches, it breaks down carbs, very similar, as I said before, to salivary amylase. Then we have pancreatic lipases. Without even looking, what do you think a pancreatic lipase breaks down? Well, I see lipid in there, so I think this enzyme is going to break down lipids, and that's exactly what it does. It breaks down complex fats and fatty acids. So far we've taken care of 2 out of our 4 macromolecules, carbohydrates and lipids. Then we have nucleases. They're going to break down nucleic acids. So believe it or not, that chicken that you had for dinner, or even if you didn't have chicken, let's say you had asparagus stalks for dinner last night, or asparagus stalks for lunch today, or this morning, or whenever it was, there's DNA that's involved there. You quite literally are what you eat, that your body breaks down those nucleic acids and incorporates them into your own DNA of your own cells that you're regenerating. So it breaks it down and rearranges it into your unique genetic code. But everything that we eat that was once living has DNA that's involved in it. So nucleases will break that down. And then finally, we have proteolytic enzymes that will break apart certain proteins. Peptidases will break down peptides into amino acids. Proteases will break down large protein complexes. And this isn't the only place where we have proteins that are broken down. Remember, we talked about the pepsinogen breaking down proteins even in the stomach. So now that we have, and all of those, the pancreatic juice is going to come through the pancreas and into the duodenum in the very first part of the small intestine. So another accessory organ outside of the large intestine is the liver. All blood leaving the absorptive surfaces of the digestive tract enter into the hepatic portal system, and that flows right into the liver. The liver cell's primary job is to extract nutrients or toxics from the blood before they get to the systemic circulation through those hepatic veins. So the liver can remove and store excess nutrients. One of the primary nutrients that you're probably very familiar with is the storage of glucose in the form of glycogen, because glycogen is stored in the liver. It can also correct nutrient deficiencies and mobilize storage reserves, or break down glycogen if your blood sugar is too low. Break down glycogen to put it into the bloodstream to raise your blood sugar up. And also things like alcohol, drugs, whether they're prescription or non-prescription drugs, it doesn't matter. The liver is still going to try to detoxify those things. And if you're abuse drugs, or if, and that could be prescription or non-prescription drugs, or abuse alcohol, then that can cause your liver to be damaged so that it's not detoxifying properly. And we call that damage, that excess fat around the liver, and kind of the hardening of the liver as a result of that cirrhosis of the liver. So on the back side of the liver, you have this little sac that we call a gallbladder. And the gallbladder's job is not to make bile. The liver actually makes the bile. That's something very important I want you to remember, that the liver makes the bile. The gallbladder just stores it. So it's just kind of a little sac that stores it in. The job of that bile is that it creates these large droplets for lipids, and it's an emulsifier. So these bile salts help to break apart those fats. You've probably seen this before, and I'm sure you've heard it, that oil and water, or another way to say this, fat and water, they don't mix very well with one another. So in order to really break down that lipid, we want to kind of separate it or spread it out. So we want emulsification to take place. So what the bile salts will do is they help to spread out that that lipid, so that the pancreatic lipase, which is not lipid soluble, can interact with the droplets that now have the bile and the lipid on it to further break it down. And we call this process of breaking down the droplets of fat emulsification. So if I asked you a question in your exam, what is the job of bile? Bile acts as an emulsifier. That's a good short answer question. Or not short answer, but fill in the blank question. So the physiology of the gallbladder releases bile into the duodenum, but only under the stimulation of the hormone closed cycle kinase, so CCK. And if we go back just a little bit to this slide here, remember we said CCK was released in the presence of lipids and carbohydrates, so there's that lipid aspect of it. So what we would have here is that on this side here, we find our pancreas, and right above that pancreas behind the stomach, you find the liver. And the bile ducts can come down from the liver, from the gallbladder, and they go into the pancreas, and they will meet up with the pancreatic duct so that the bile as well as the pancreatic juices are going to be released in this first part of the small intestine, the duodenum, at the same time. So as we've already been talking about, the coordination of this digestive system is so elaborate and so complex that it's under neural and hormonal control, and a lot of those hormones, actually all of those hormones and a good chunk of those nerves are all local. They're enteric endocrine cells, enteric nervous system cells that will coordinate the activities and of these digestive glands, and then the regulatory mechanisms around the duodenum, where acids are neutralized or where enzymes are added. So just kind of a recap that the coordination of this whole secretion, absorption, digestion process is under hormonal and neural control. So those hormones, again, that we had just briefly talked about when we were looking at the stomach, where we say gastrin is released by G cells in the stomach. It's also released by G cells in the duodenum of the small intestine. It promotes increased motility of the stomach. So I'm going to highlight what are some major things that you should remember about each of these hormones that we're going to go over in this next few slides. Gastrin primarily promotes stomach motility, so that churning of the stomach. Secretin's job, it's released when chyme arrives in the duodenum, or the first part of the small intestine. It increases the secretion of bile and buffer from the liver and the pancreas. So that pancreatic juice and that bile that comes from the liver, remember, bile is not made by the gallbladder, it's just stored in the gallbladder. So its big job here for secretins is to increase the secretions of bile and by secretions that come from the liver and the pancreas. Gastric inhibitory peptide is secreted when fats and carbohydrates enter the small intestine. CCK, secreted in the duodenum, accelerates the production of and secretion of digestive enzymes from the pancreas, including that bile. That bile is going to come through what we call a hepatopancreatic sphincter, so it helps to relax that sphincter and relax the sphincters of the gallbladder in order to bring that bile in along with pancreatic lipase. VIP, or vasoactive intestinal peptides, big job is to dilate those capillaries of the small intestine so that these things that we've broken down into their teeny tiny monomers, the amino acids or the nucleotides or the glycerol heads and fatty acid tails or whatever it is that it's broken down further, that we now want to get it into the bloodstream and get it to all the cells of the body. So the vasoactive intestinal protein, big job is to dilate those capillaries. So it also inhibits the acid production in the stomach, and it's going to increase the secretion of the intestinal glands itself. But real big thing, and I'm going to circle it because it's real important, I believe, the dilation of those capillaries. Enterocrinin stimulates mucus production by the submucosal glands of the duodenum, and that's important because remember that chyme that came from the stomach, very low pH. So we want that pH to rise up and not be so acidic. Sorry. Had to blow my nose there. Didn't want you guys to hear that. All right, so those major activities of the digestive system, or the digestive system hormones, I should say, is that, remember we had gastrin that was released, and the job of gastrin was to promote stomach motility, and it also produced the secretions by the parietal cells as well as those chief cells. And then when the chyme entered into the small intestine, GIP is going to inhibit gastrics on there. It helps to release insulin from the pancreas. We also had CCK and secretin that was released that also, remember, secretin also acts antagonistically with gastrin, so it doesn't show it on this picture, but I do want you to remember that secretin inhibits the production of gastrin. So if gastrin's going on, then we got stomach stuff going on. Once this food comes out of the stomach, or the chyme goes out of the stomach and goes into the small intestine, then we have intestinal stuff going on. So we really don't need stomach stuff going on anymore. So other jobs other than inhibiting gastrin production is that we release the pancreatic enzymes, we released bile from the liver and ejected from the gallbladder. We're also going to have the blood vessels dilate so that we can get these nutrients that we have just broken down into little teeny tiny parts so they can get into the bloodstream. The release of insulin from the pancreas is going to facilitate nutrient utilization by all of those tissues and nutrient absorption. And then as the material arrives into the duodenum, or the middle portion of the small intestine, then we have this absorption of those nutrients on there. So we're absorbing them into the bloodstream. We're fully absorbing them into the bloodstream so they can go to the cells and do what they need to do to nourish those cells. And when we say nutrient utilization by all the tissues, once the pancreas has been stimulated to not only make the pancreatic juices, it's also going to be stimulated to make this and release more insulin. And remember, insulin is the key that's needed by cells in order for glucose to get into the cell. So we need an insulin to come into the cell in order to get this insulin to act as a key onto the cell, receptors of the cells, so that glucose can get into it. So now we are down into the large intestine. At this point, we have, in a healthy body, absorbed all the things that we need to absorb, all the nutrients that we want to absorb primarily. So now we just really have to deal with the absorption of water. So the big important function of the digestive system, I think it's really important because I love water, is the reabsorption of water. In addition to that, there are important vitamins that are produced by bacteria like E. coli that live in your large intestine, and we've talked about some of the jobs of E. coli in the blood cell chapter, the very beginning of the semester. But it also takes whatever waste products that your body isn't going to use, and it compacts them into fecal matter, and it is the temporary storage material or storage location of fecal matter prior to getting it out of your body, which we call defecation. Along the tail of your appendix, or your large intestines, is your appendix. We call it the vermiform appendix. It's the same exact thing. It is basically a lymphoid tissue, and because there are so many bacteria that are in the large intestine, that we want to make sure that we keep those loads or numbers down. So that your appendix primarily is the lymphatic or the immune aspect of your digestive system. Sometimes people with an appendix will become inflamed and they'll have appendicitis, or they'll have an infection of the appendix. And a lot of times it's usually children because their appendix doesn't grow nearly as fast as the rest of their body may grow. And so if you have a really small, narrow appendix, it's more likely to become overrun by bacteria and become infected, and you just have to have it removed. No big deal. You can totally live without it. You've got other lymphoid organs. The colon is kind of also what we call the large intestine. It has different routes that it goes. For the small intestine, it is just kind of these giant squiggles that we'll have all in there, so they're kind of going left and right and everything. With your colon, you have an ascending, transverse, and a descending colon. Very large diameter, much larger than the small intestine. There are these pouches that we call haustra that allow for the colon to become more elongated and to expand. So it allows for it to kind of get larger and to expand as needed. The rectum is the last portion of the digestive tract, the last about 6 inches of it. It's even more expandable than the other parts of your colon are, and it needs to be expandable because that's where you're temporarily going to store this waste that you no longer need anymore. So this indigestible food that you don't really use, that we consider waste, we absorbed all the water out of it, we absorbed all the nutrients out of that. That was once chyme, now it's considered fecal matter, and we're going to just temporarily house it in the rectum. The movement of the fecal material into the rectum is going to trigger the urge to defecate. So if you have a non-potty trained child, like I have a non-potty trained child, as soon as that food goes through her digestive system and she's absorbed all the things that she wants out of it, and it lands in her rectum, it's then going to very soon land in her diaper. So she has not learned to control the second set of muscles that are responsible for holding in that feces until she gets to a proper receptacle. That is something that we are working on teaching her. So right now, that urge to defecate, she just goes like most 1-year-olds. She's just going to go. The anal canal is that last portion of the rectum. And you have these longitudinal folds called anal columns that are in there. The anal orifice, or the anus, is the exit of the anus canal, the anal canal, and there are keratinized epidermal cells that are very much like skin cells. So vitamins produced in the large intestine, I'm going to highlight these because they're important. We have vitamin K that's produced. We need vitamin K, as we remember from our blood cell chapter, for making blood cells, for clotting factors. We have biotin, which is important for glucose metabolism, and then vitamin B5, which is needed to make steroid hormones and some neurotransmitters. So, and when I say steroid hormones, I'm thinking estrogen, testosterone, cholesterol, that sort of thing, not the anabolic steroids. So these are all organic, if you will. Vitamins that are produced by the large intestine, many, especially vitamin K, with the help of bacteria, E. coli. So the organic waste, the bacteria that live in there are going to feed on those indigestible carbohydrates. So think cellulose from plant-based foods, or beans, the outside of the bean, your body doesn't actually digest that. So the bacteria are going to feed on those indigestible carbohydrates because they do have the enzymes, or some of the enzymes that are required to break it down, whereas we do not. And when those bacteria release their waste products, it's going to produce intestinal gas or flatulence, which is translated to us is that it's farting. So really it's not you that's farting, it's the bacteria that's breaking down your indigestible husk of the beans that you ate in your taco salad that have left their waste products that's causing you to fart. So it's a very, very technical aspect. And people that are vegetarian, if you know a lot of vegetarian people, or if you're vegetarian yourself, you probably noticed that they are a little more gassy than the meat eaters are. So people that eat a lot of heavy meat-laden diets aren't nearly as gassy as those that have more plant-based diets. So to eliminate your feces, we talked about how the movement of the fecal matter into the rectum is going to trigger that want to go to the bathroom, that defecation triggers that defecation. It requires relaxation of both your internal and your external anal sphincters. For little kids that are not potty trained, or even if they are potty trained, sometimes when they got to go, they just can't control that external sphincter, and it's just like, whoo, there it goes. So reflexes open the internal sphincter and close the external sphincter. The opening of the external sphincter requires conscious effort sometimes for that to take place. So people that have had lower spinal injuries and paralyzed from the waist down, sometimes they will have problems with constipation because they can't release that sphincter. They can't consciously do that because they've had the nerves have been damaged from their waist down. So sometimes constipation and having to be given laxatives is required. In addition, on the other side of that, because very small children, like a 1-year-old, or maybe even up to 15 months old, that those tracts to go to their brain that tells them to consciously control the opening or the closing of that sphincter itself, they're not very, those tracts aren't fully developed yet. So that's why they say it's kind of futile to try to potty train a child that's under 1 or under 15 months. Although some people claim to have done it, but a lot of times the tracts there for the nervous system tracts for that conscious control to take place, they're just not fully developed yet. So these dates here, ignore them. In fact, I'm going to just scribble them out because they don't refer to this semester. I forgot they were in there. So that never happened. Oh man, that I told you guys to erase. So those don't exist. We have our dates for our exams and our lab practicals. So here are the learning outcomes that you'll need to study for our next test that comes up that will include digestive system and metabolism, and there's one more set of lecture notes that will be involved there. All right. Have a great morning, noon, or night.